So essentially, Google is looking to do two things because they care about keeping their users, their customers, me and you, searchers, happy. They want to deliver the most high quality and the most relevant search results to searchers. So when someone types something in, they ideally want those top websites to be the highest quality and the most relevant so that those people are going to be happy with the results of their search.
Podcasting is hard, so why not get a little coaching? Welcome to Podcast Coaching with Christine. I'm your host, Christine O'Donnell. I'm an Emmy-nominated TV journalist and podcast coach. Each week, I interview someone who has an exceptional story and talent to help independent podcasters grow their shows. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Podcast Coaching with Christine. On this week's podcast, I am having a little bit of fun with SEO. SEO, what is it? It's search engine optimization. I actually did an amazing episode on this in the past with Stefan Spencer. If you haven't checked that episode out and you're still curious about SEO after you listen to this one, I highly recommend going back and checking it. I'll also link to it in the show notes on my website, christine-o'donnell.com. And So what do we talk about? The past few weeks, months or so, I have been experimenting with SEO, newsworthiness, and incorporating the tools that I know as a journalist, as well as the tools that I have learned, like with my time spent as a podcaster and in marketing to figure out if there's an algorithm to this or a special way to do it. And guys, I have uncovered so many amazing things and worked with my members of my community to do this for them. One of them, who I just cannot shout out enough, she doubled her downloads by just making a few small tweaks to her titles and to her description. And these are SEO tweaks based on some of the things that I have shared with her. So if you are interested in doubling your downloads, no big deal. This episode, we share so much good stuff about that. We also are creating a test with this episode about SEO for podcasters to see how we can rank this podcast for SEO for podcasters. So it's like a meta subject matter, and we're testing it in this podcast about podcasting. Is this too much for you guys? Okay. All right. So before I share some more with you, including this amazing interview with Krista Walsh, she is an expert at both website copywriting and SEO. I wanted to take a minute to shout out a listener who has left an amazing review. This is from Pop Fit Studio. They also say that they are a new podcaster and they're writing, as a new podcaster, Christine's show has really helped me in areas I didn't even know about. Perfect show with anyone with a podcast. Thank you. Thank you. I so appreciate that, Pop Fit Studio, and congratulations on your new podcast. I hope that it is continuing to rock and roll. And if you want to write back to me or shoot me a DM on Instagram at the Christine OD, I am happy to check out your show and just kind of do everything I can to help you grow. That is the point of this podcast, is to help independent podcasters grow their shows. All right. Speaking of, without further ado, here's this week's episode. Hello and welcome to
Sorry.
Hello and welcome to Podcast Coaching with Christine. I'm your host, Christine O'Donnell. I am an Emmy-nominated TV journalist and podcast coach, and each week, I put out shows to help you grow your podcast, brand, and business. This is a resource for growth, community, and inspiration. And on this week's episode, we are talking podcast SEO tips. And we have an SEO expert and copywriter, Krista Walsh, joining us. Krista, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Christine. I am so happy to be here.
I'm glad you're here. We actually just did a workshop together last night, and I got great feedback from everyone who attended. So I never quite know if people are going to send feedback right away or not. And it's just crazy. I did get a lot of people saying, thank you so much. Krista was so great. What's her information again? So yeah, it was awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. That was very fun. And people had really good questions. It was a good group.
Yes. We've got a new one coming out on transcription coming up. Soon. I think that will be important. But something to orient everyone who's joining, something that is important that Krista talked about actually in her workshop with Bright-Sided last night was how to do a keyword search for what your podcast episode is going to be about so that it actually truly does rank for SEO. So right before we started this episode today, we did that. Do you want to kind of talk us through what that even means or how we did that?
Sure. Yeah. So keyword research, right, is just the process of identifying which keyword that you're trying to get your piece of content to rank in Google for. So keyword is something that people are typing into Google every month. Like enough people are doing that every month that it's become recognized as like this keyword phrase. It's not an ordinary phrase anymore. It's a keyword phrase. So keyword research is just the process of identifying which phrase you're going to try to rank in Google for.
And once you discover it, then you have to say it while you're doing your show. And you also have to include it in the description and in your show notes at least a few times.
Yeah, absolutely. When it's something like a podcast or a blog or something like some piece of content that is like you're creating it anew, I recommend creating it with SEO in mind. So actually use this keyword research process to dream up the podcast episode topic itself and then create the whole episode around that keyword, because Google is smart and it's going to know if you just sort of shove in a keyword that it's not super relevant, but you're kind of just like, oh my gosh, now I got to rank this podcast episode in Google. So you're going to do a lot better with ranking on Google. And also it's going to make a little more sense for your readers if you create your episode with your keyword in mind from the get-go.
Yes. This is kind of funny to me. So merging SEO with my background is news. So I like constantly am like putting the two of them together in my mind, because to me also to rank and to show up, you've got to be newsworthy. So it's like, but SEO is kind of like newsworthy for your niche instead of like newsworthy for the world. And I also found sometimes just as a reporter, when it came to writing my stories, or like maybe the same as when it comes to like writing your descriptions or figuring out what your show is going to be about, sometimes you may even uncover it while you're recording. Like you might not know that the juicy thing that your show should be about, that it actually is going to happen until your interview ends, because this juicy piece of knowledge was news. Like it came out during your discussion. So I bring this up because I personally love the idea of coming in like, hey, this is our word. We want to rank podcast SEO tips. But perhaps you share like some insane podcast specific piece of knowledge that you weren't like, we didn't even know was going to come out. And now all of a sudden it's like, make money with this one thing. When you're recording your show. And then what does, now should I redo everything, or should it still be that one thing, or are you following? Am I making sense?
Yeah, I'm totally following. Yeah, sometimes with something like a podcast, especially like an interview style that's not totally planned and it's definitely not scripted, it can go off the rails a little bit. I mean, my advice to that would be like, follow your instinct, especially you as a journalist. Like you have that instinct of what is the meaty part of the episode. And if it turns out that it's not what you thought, and so you're not going to try to rank for that keyword anymore, it's okay. It's all right. Possibly you can find another keyword at that point that you could try to put in your descriptions and etc. But even if not, I think above all, my advice for anyone creating a podcast or any type of content really is to always create for your listener first and think about the algorithms and etc. second, because Well, because basically Google is considering the quality of your content above all, because they want to deliver quality search results to their customers, which are all of us who Google. So when in doubt, serve your listener first, serve your audience first, and don't think about it in terms of like, I got to do like all these like fancy algorithm tricks or something, you know?
I think that is something we kind of always question. So I appreciate you saying that because I agree. The listener is first. And I always think, what is this? What is going to help my listener the most? And I also did this as a reporter, not at first because I didn't understand it at first. It's so easy to think that if something matters to you, that it'll matter to your listeners, but it doesn't. It's not always that, which is just so interesting. So to share a little bit more, guys, about who you're listening to, Krista is an SEO website copywriter for creative entrepreneurs. She writes the messaging for her clients' websites so that their online home shows up in Google, articulates their vision and value, and inspires visitors to take action. Her expertise, guys, is SEO and copywriting. So one of the things that we talked about is how to make Google your 24/7 podcast discovery machine. And that we went over this last night. So if we were to back up and just be like, hey, if you're brand new to podcasting and you're confused about SEO, how would you explain that to people?
Yeah. Like, how would I explain SEO?
Yeah. What does SEO mean?
Yeah. So I love to use this sort of old school analogy when I'm describing what SEO is to people who are very in the dark or scared about what it is. If you remember back in the day, we had this thing called the Yellow Pages, like a phone book. And if you were looking for someone like a plumber, you would flip to the P's of that giant Yellow Pages, and then you would get this long list of plumbers. And inevitably, there would be at least one company that would have named their company ABC Plumbing. And they did that strategically. And their whole reason for doing that was pretty much so that they would show up first in that list of plumbers in the Yellow Pages in their area. Because they knew that human behavior says people are not going to randomly call number 10 on the list. They're going to call the first one first. So they get a lot more business just because they're more visible and they're first in that list. So SEO is essentially that idea, but for the internet. So when somebody goes looking for what you have to offer, for example, if they're looking for information about traveling to Vietnam, that was somebody that went to our workshop yesterday, had a podcast all about Vietnam and traveling there. Getting your podcast up first in that list is going to, or, up in the top, at least in that list, is going to do a lot as far as it comes to getting clicks and visibility to your work.
And how do you do it?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a great question. I think couple important things to know. So podcasts in 2019, Google announced that, okay, we're going to start ranking audio files of podcasts directly in search results. So, if you like search for something, you'll often get like a bunch of like actual website links, but you'll also sometimes get like YouTube videos that start showing up directly and you'll get like images. Podcast audio files now have the potential to show up in regular search results. So that's really important because now we can start thinking about our podcast creation from the perspective of SEO.
Yeah. So, and I've seen this. I'm sure you've seen this if you guys have Googled something, and especially if podcast is somehow in the phrase, these like little audio files pop up right at the top, and to almost to be like an instructional content or instructional video in the same way that YouTube videos pop up at the top. So it's still kind of, how do you make it so that Google puts your episode, so it's one of those first 3 that shows up?
Yeah. Yes. So my first advice to people who are new to SEO is to explain a little bit about how Google decides which websites or which like pieces of content to rank in their search results. because unlike the yellow pages, it's not just as like cut and dry of we're going to do like things alphabetically. Like it's not like it's a little bit more nuanced and smart. Not a little bit, it's a lot of bit more nuanced and smart than that. It's not alphabetical for anyone who's listening. So essentially Google is looking to do two things because they care about keeping their users, their customers, me and you, searchers, happy. They want to deliver the most high quality and the most relevant search results to searchers. So when someone types something in, they ideally want those top websites to be the highest quality and the most relevant so that those people are going to be happy with the results of their search. So with that in mind, there's a couple things you can do. Actually, let me back up a little bit. So when we're talking about high quality search results, Google decides which pieces of content are high quality, basically based around how important and trustworthy they think that your website or piece of content is. So they're looking at things like how much traffic is that piece of content getting? Because if a lot of people are visiting it every month, they know that they're like inferring that, okay, a lot of people are heading to this piece of content every month. It must be pretty good, right? They're also looking for things like how many other people are linking to that piece of content, because they're looking around and they're saying all these other websites or links are pointing to this, they're referring to this one piece of content. It must be pretty important. They might also, depending on if you actually are posting your podcast on like a website domain, they're going to be looking at how long your domain has been around. Because if it's been around for a while, it's like, okay, this is pretty established. It's not brand new. We can trust it. We know something about it. So those are kind of the factors that go into how high quality Google thinks your piece of content is. Also things like, is it actually high quality? Like, is it fairly long? It's not like 2 minutes long. Is it, does it make sense? Like, do people like it? Is it well organized? That sort of stuff.
Consistent. Mm-hmm.
Consistent. Yeah.
Consistent, a format so that it's actually a show that comes out regularly. Something a lot of podcasters do, but not all podcasters do. And so I want to make that clear for people who are listening and they're like, wait a second, I have a podcast, but I don't have a website. Do I need to have a website to make my podcast episodes show up in Google?
Mm-hmm. So not technically. Like I said, in 2019, Google starts saying, okay, we're going to start ranking audio files just like we do video files. Like, so somebody who posts a video on YouTube doesn't also have to post the video on their website in order to rank, right? Same thing with podcasts, theoretically. However, I very rarely see this happening in the wild. Like normally with most like keyword searches, and I do a lot of this sort of, I pay attention to search results because I'm in this industry. And I very rarely see podcast files being ranked for ordinary search terms. When I do see them being ranked, it's because somebody has added the word podcast into their search term. So, you know, let's say like the ordinary search term I'm talking about is like traveling in Vietnam, right? Most of the results I'm guessing are going to be websites, some videos, maybe some images. Probably not audio files. But if somebody types in traveling in Vietnam podcast, suddenly we start getting all these audio files. So yeah, it's definitely possible to not have a website or a video or anything and have your podcast rank on Google. It's just going to be only shown likely, in my opinion, to people who are looking specifically for that podcast format, which is not a loss. Like that's possibly a lot of people are looking specifically for podcast format. It is a bit of a missed opportunity though, because you're not getting in front of people who are just looking for information related to your topic in general. You're only getting in front of those people who are looking for podcast format specifically.
Yeah. And actually there's something I wanted to share. So ranking in Google in Google, just in Google in general, is different than ranking in Apple Podcast. Yeah. So like there's a different, like an SEO matters for Apple Podcast in the same way that it matters for Google. It's just a different place that it's housed, if that makes sense. So there's a number of different ways to make your show pop to the surface depending on where people are looking for it. So while it might, like, certain things might be important for one platform like Google, it might be a little bit different for Apple Podcasts, and maybe a little bit different for Spotify, and maybe a little bit different for Stitcher. So there's so many different places and different ways you can kind of weave your episodes so that they show up first, so that they're more discoverable some places than other. So while I recommend kind of learning how this works and applying tools that you feel or strategies that you feel like comfortable doing, it can, because also, I mean, gosh, doing everything at once can be super overwhelming. So I don't want, if you're listening and you're like, oh, I am just finally understanding what it means to do a keyword search, a research, and now I'm understanding that my audience is in Google and they're searching these things, and so I should incorporate those same terms or phrases into my show. And doing this, like, one show is this, one show is that, one show is the other, is going to do something different for you than it may do in Apple Podcasts, but it is still beneficial for you to do it for Apple Podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Clear? I feel like I always have to double check just because I have so super mom brain that I'm like, really don't know. I have a nursing daughter. Pretty much my brain is just like coming out of me every single like few hours. I just like lose brain cells. True.
That's story. I think that was clear. And it's important to say, usually when people talk about SEO, search engine optimization, they're talking about the mother of all search engines, which is Google. But we have to remember that there are like dozens of different search engines. Like Apple Podcast is its own little baby search engine. You know, Spotify is one, even like Pinterest is one, YouTube is one, right? So it does sort of depend. Yes, Instagram. Like all the social media platforms most of them are like little search engines. So your strategy maybe needs to zoom out even farther than just like, what's my SEO strategy? It may need to be, where are my target audience? Where are they hanging out? Like, are they finding podcasts on Google? Are they finding them on Apple Podcasts? Are they finding them on Pinterest or Instagram? And that's going to change everything about where you focus your SEO efforts. Because maybe you find that, like, I know like there's a large survey out there that says 73% of people do discover new podcasts just via the internet, like via Google. However, that's just an average across everybody, you know? So if you have a niche podcast, you may find that they're all about Spotify or they're like all about YouTube, you know? Like, so you really maybe have to survey your audience or do some deeper level strategy. Yeah, market research, exactly.
So if someone were to do some, and we talked about, I just kind of gave an example of this, but if someone were to think to themselves, all right, where do I start to do research, like keyword research? Is it just going into Google, pretending I'm my ideal audience and typing into Google as that person, like what kind of questions that person might search? Or like, where would you say people start? And are there tools that can help people do this?
Yeah, that actually is where I would start. Yes, that's where I would start. I want to back up a tiny bit because I remember earlier I said Google is looking at how it's looking for like delivering high quality search results. And I covered what they're looking for with that, but they're also looking for relevant search results. And that is where this keyword piece comes in, because it's essentially you telling the search engine, hello, my content is relevant for this search term. So that's what we're talking about here. And this is where you have more of the control, is this relevancy piece. So when we're talking about keyword research, yes, I actually do recommend starting with like your brain, like starting with your brainstorming process. So if you know your target audience and you know what your podcast is about, what types of content do you think they are like interested in hearing about, like, or what questions might they have about your broad topic, it's probably similar to the process that you go through when you're dreaming up podcast episodes just without even SEO in mind at all. It's probably really similar to that. And then write down all of those things. And just, I don't think I said this before, so I'm going to say it now. A keyword is really like a keyword phrase. So we're not looking for like a single word. We're looking for something someone's typing into Google, which is rarely ever a single word. Like if you think about your own behavior as a Googler, you're probably not typing in like, I'm going to learn about like Cheerios today. I don't know. Like you're probably like typing something like, are Cheerios really good for my heart? ? Like, so like something like that, like it's a way more specific, and sometimes it's a full sentence. Sometimes it's just like 2 to 4 words, but all of that is really what we're talking about when we're talking about keywords. So yeah, start with your brain, brainstorm a list. And then I recommend using some free tools to sort of amp up your brainstorming process. So you can get these keywords that you maybe wouldn't just think about on your own. And the ones I recommend, I really like this one called Keyword Shitter. Hopefully I can say that on this podcast. That is the real name of the website.
It is. And
I like Keywords Everywhere. There's a tool called Answer the Public, and then there's Uber Suggest. These are the ones that I would go to first. They all basically work the same way. You put in one of your keywords that you brainstormed, and then it shoots out a bunch of others that are related. And so you
shoots
can take
out or something close to shoot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So then you can take all of those and add them to your list. So now you have this long list. And then I would start editing that list pretty ruthlessly. So I would cross off anything that isn't super relevant to what your podcast is, or cross off anything that you're just like, I don't want to talk about this at all. Cross off anything that has a searcher intent that is a bit wrong. So people are often Googling things either to buy something, to hire someone, to learn about something, or to like compare things. So for most podcasts, we're probably looking in that learn about category, maybe the compare category, depending. But so cross off anything where it's somebody's just looking to buy a product or hire a service or something. So once you have your tight list of keyword phrases that you're like, these are all things that I could legit make a podcast about and feel pretty good about doing, then you can narrow down even further by finding some actual data behind how many people are searching for that per month and how challenging is it going to be to rank for that keyword.
Okay, so this is interesting because now that we're here, and how challenging will it be to rank for that keyword? This might mean that just because a keyword is really common, we shouldn't use it because everybody is using it, and we're not going to rank as easily as we would if we were to choose a keyword that was a little bit more specific. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of a balance between those two, right? So it's like we definitely want people to be looking for this every month, because otherwise, like if nobody's looking for it, like it's very uncommon, then what's even the point? Because we'll rank on page 1 for some like obscure thing, but nobody's actually seeing us anyway. But we also don't want it to be so common that like we're competing against like Tim Ferriss's podcast, for example, or like some like ginormous podcast machine, or just any website that is very big and very like established, because it's going to be more challenging to outrank that piece of content simply because of that high quality piece that Google is looking for. So established websites, established podcasts, they already have that piece squared away because Google is like, all right, you've got so much traffic per month. You've been around for 10 years. Like you're good, right?
Yeah. So we did this again at the beginning, right before we started recording. And the search term that we are using in this podcast is podcast SEO tips. And the goal is for this podcast that we're doing together to rank for the search phrase, podcast SEO tips, when people type that into Google, when people type that into Apple Podcasts, when they type it into, say, Instagram, this is the search phrase that I'm going to continue to use, not only in the show, in the actual audio recording, but also as part of my headline and perhaps in my description as well. Is there like a rule to how many times we should mention the phrase that we are hoping to rank for?
No, there is no rule. Yay. So you can, my rule of thumb is to like mention it as often as it feels natural. So if your podcast topic is the keyword that you're trying to rank for, like you're very naturally, probably without trying or thinking about it, you're going to say it. I advise against saying it, just like shoving it into your sentences awkwardly because you're trying to get it in there. Because again, we always want to prioritize our listeners or the people consuming our content over the algorithms.
Yeah. So are there any tricks to SEO that podcasters could use to make their show rank more than others that you're aware of?
Yeah. So if
I should say in Google, rank in Google.
Yeah. As I was just going to say, I was saying if we're talking about Google, I wouldn't call it a trick, but I would recommend that you post your podcast on a web page. So because I just want to increase the chances that you're going to be discovered on Google and not necessarily only be discovered by people who are literally looking for an audio file. So it's pretty easy for most people if you record your podcast, get them transcribed, and just post the transcription on like a blog page that you have on your website. So that way your website page can be discoverable as well, not just the audio file. And most people are probably not going to sit there and read a transcript. So they're probably going to find that and then click the link that you have included there that takes them to actually listen to the audio. So they're still going to be listeners. It's very unlikely that they're just going to read unless they are like they have an auditory impairment or something. Another thing you can do is if you're recording video, like we're doing for this podcast, you can post that video on YouTube. And that's just another way of getting your podcast content discovered in search engines, not just Google, because Google seems to be ranking videos a lot more than audio files, but also YouTube, right? So it's just all of these easy things that you can do to boost your visibility in Google.
Yeah. So, excuse me. I was thinking about something and then my brain broke.
Mommy brain.
Thank you. So just to recap, you're saying, get a web page. So invest in creating a website for our podcast on top of, just the podcast. And also, if we can, put it on YouTube as well.
Yeah, that's what I would recommend.
Like, what does it take to, what are your thoughts on, I know this is your special space when it comes to website development, and how much is needed for a podcast to build a website, and what does that look like? Is it really hard? Is it really costly?
That's a good question. I don't think if you're like purely a podcaster and you're creating a website purely to host your podcast episodes, I don't think you need to spend a lot of money. Like just create like a DIY website, like through Squarespace, probably the easiest one, but there's WordPress, there's Wix, there's these other like Showit that are all DIY. Just have like a homepage that's like, hey, here's our podcast. And then you can have another tab that's like, here are all our episodes. And then each one, you essentially set it up like a blog, right? So each one has its own URL, so that URL can rank in Google search results.
So like each podcast episode has a page, like a blog. Would you recommend putting the transcript as well into the podcast page, or should that be at the blog, or how would you put that?
What do you mean? Do you mean the podcast page. What do you mean by that?
So when I say podcast page, I'm thinking episode page. So with every episode, say every episode page is this equivalent to a blog post. Do we include the transcription in the blog post or the episode page?
Yeah, yes, that is what I would do. I think that's the easiest thing to do. I know some companies who will like write a blog post, kind of like a summary of what they talked about, instead of the transcript. But I don't think you have to do that. And it's going to be a lot easier just to post the transcript there, like as the blog. It's just the transcript. Because like I said, I don't think many people are going to read the full thing. They might read some of it, but the point is kind of to like be like, here is this episode. And if it's intriguing to you, include the link where they can actually listen to it too.
They can listen to it, or maybe like break it up so that it's like question, answer, and not just one like big block of text.
Yeah. That's a good idea too, to format it a little bit more. So if you have your transcript and it's just like the little like numbers and then a paragraph and you're not sure who's talking, if you want to, especially if it's an interview style, breaking it up like that.
Yeah, and there's a couple different tools that work for transcription. I believe Otter is a free tool. Is there any else that you can think of off the top of your head?
I know there's Rev, there is Scribby.
Rev is not free.
No, those are not.
Rev.
None of those two aren't free.
So. Yeah. Another hack, if you are going to post your podcast on YouTube, YouTube will transcribe a whole episode for you and do closed captioning. It takes a while. So it's like you would post that video, maybe unlist it, and then ask them that you want it closed captioned, the whole thing. And if you want the whole thing closed captioned, they'll transcribe the episode and then you can copy and paste it from your YouTube into a Word doc or a Google Doc and edit it. Oh,
neat. That's a neat hack. I like that.
Just every once in a while, I pull out a good one. A good podcast SEO tip. Thank you. So when it comes to this is something you mentioned, and I was also thinking about. It's getting backlinks to your website is one of the best things you can do to boost your SEO. Mm-hmm. So say you invest a very small amount of money for like a website domain and a Squarespace or a WordPress or whatever. That could be, I don't know, maybe 15, depending on how, like what you get upsold in the process of buying. But, and the protections, it's going to, get all these protections. But that would be maybe $50 a year. Is that right? For like the bare minimum?
Yeah, I think so. I think Squarespace is the most expensive and it's like $20 a month. So.
Oh, okay.
But,
Yeah, I think WordPress has other options and some also website media or podcast media hosting companies will provide a website for you. You just need to purchase the domain name. So, and I believe Namecheap is the cheapest place to purchase a domain name. So yeah, you can maybe get this for around $50 a year on top of however much you're spending on your episodes. So I always try to like budget these things in my head because I know podcasters are conscious about how much money they're spending. So if you create this whole episode and you've got your description, your time codes, and then your whole transcript of your show that you've broken up so it looks pretty, ish. For your listeners, how would you suggest people get backlinks to that episode? Would you send it out to other people and ask them to please post it in their website?
That's one strategy. Yeah, I don't know how that effective that. So backlinks are when another website links to your website. Like they're like, here is Christine's podcast, and it's like hyperlinked and it links to her website, right? So sometimes people do this thing called like cold outreach, where they will email websites that they've found and they think are related to their content. And they're like, hey, can you please post this on your website? Like I get a lot of those emails from random people. That's a very time consuming strategy with a low return because it's just like people you don't know. And, like you're basically asking for a favor from somebody that you don't know on the internet. And so that's a strategy if you have like a lot of time and you're willing just to like do that and do that and do that. I would try to get things like guest blog spots, be featured on someone else's podcast. Those are probably better strategies because you're offering something other than just like, hey, give me a backlink. You're like, let me share my expertise on your podcast or talk, or let me write a blog post for your audience on your website. Because if they have a website for their podcast, they'll likely hyperlink you when they're like, okay, we're having, like Krista Walsh on my podcast, like hyperlink to my website where people can find out more about me. So things like that. Media features is actually another way to do it. So if you get featured in the media, they will often hyperlink you, and you can request that it be your podcast website.
I'm trying to break this down into an example. You're on my show. Thank you so much. When I post this episode on my website and I backlink your name and your business to you, my website, I don't think it has a super high domain authority right now compared to yours because you're an expert at this. Could that hurt you if I were to do that?
No. So of course it's like you get more juice from the people who have been around for a long time and they have a very large domain authority, right? Like if I were to like get linked in like the Washington Post or something, like that would be huge for me, right? Not only because their readership is huge, but just for the SEO potential too. But it does help you, even people who are on your level or who are below your level, brand new websites, that does help you too. The only time you're going to get penalized by Google is if you're doing like a black hat technique where you like buy a bunch of spammy backlinks from websites that exist only to give backlinks. And that's like their business model. They're like, pay us, $20 and we'll backlink your website on all of our 500 fake websites. So if you suddenly have 500 backlinks from websites with zero domain authority and zero traffic, then what will happen is like Google will get flagged and then they'll do an investigation to see if you're like trying to trick the algorithm. And then it can eventually penalize you if they find out you are. But just like a friend of yours who's just started a website is going to link you for a legitimate reason, that's going to help you, not hurt you.
Okay. So, and doing like a guest blog post is literally like writing an article and then posting that on a friend's blog?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you'd have a byline, right? That would be linked to your website.
To your website. And maybe you can also do an embed. Would you want to do an embed of your podcast episode in that article if it was relevant? Or would you want to just have people come back to your website? Like if you have more embed codes out there, will that also be good for your podcast's RSS feed?
I think it would help because it's just more directly inviting people to do it. You tend to like lose some people every time you ask them to take another action. So if somebody's reading that article and they're really interested in listening to that particular episode, they probably will like crack open Apple Podcasts and like find it, like search for it. But if you just have the link directly in there or the embed, even, that's what you're talking about. You might get other people who maybe wouldn't take that extra step to go search for it themselves, but they're just going to listen to it because they're there on your page.
Got it. This is good. I feel like this has been a lot of juice for podcasters listening. I hope it's been good juice. Thank you, Krista. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, I don't think so. This has been really fun. So I hope it's beneficial for people listening.
I think so. I think these have been some great podcast SEO tips.
Absolutely.
I just keep saying it. I have it written down right here. So I just keep saying it over and over again.
Hack from Christine. Write your keyword down in front of you as you're recording.
Just keep on saying it over and over again. Thank you, Krista, so much for being on the show. You guys, if you want to find out more about Krista, you should check out her website. It is KristaWalshCopywriter.com. I will, of course, link to it in my show notes and also on the episode page on my website, Christine-O'Donnell.com. Thank you so much again. And Krista, until next time, have a lovely day.
Have a lovely day too.
All right. And that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to another episode of Podcast Coaching with Christine. For more information on this week's episode, be sure to check the show notes. You can also find more information on my website, Christine-O'Donnell.com. There's a bunch of resources over there as well, and more information about my community if you would like to join it. Again, that's Christine-O'Donnell.com. If this podcast helped you in any way, please let me know. You can always screenshot that you've listened to this episode and then share it in your stories and tag me on Instagram. I am happy to reshare your story and let more people know about what you're doing, your podcast. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you next time.